The Georgia sun hung heavy over Whitmore Plantation in the summer of 1821, casting long shadows across the cotton fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The air was thick with humidity and the constant buzz of cicadas, creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to weigh down on everything it touched. Josiah wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he made his way back from the fields, his 70-year-old bones aching with each step. He had been born on this plantation, had watched 3 generations of Whitmores come and go, and had long ago accepted that he would die here among the red clay and Spanish moss. His only companion in these twilight years was Brutus, a massive hound with intelligent brown eyes and a coat as black as the Georgia night. The dog had been acting strangely for days now, whimpering and pacing around the abandoned storage shed behind the slave quarters. The building had been empty for years, ever since the previous overseer had declared it structurally unsound. Weeds had grown up around its foundation, and the wooden walls had begun to sag under the weight of neglect. As Josiah approached his small cabin, Brutus suddenly bolted toward the shed, his powerful legs carrying him across the dusty ground with unusual urgency. The old slave called after him, but the dog paid no attention. Instead, Brutus began digging frantically at a spot near the shed's rear corner, his claws scraping against the hard-packed earth with desperate intensity. "What's got into you, boy?" Josiah muttered, following slowly. The evening air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms and something else, something metallic and old that made his stomach turn. Brutus's digging grew more frenzied, dirt flying in all directions as he worked. Within minutes, his claws struck something solid with a sharp metallic ring that echoed strangely in the humid air. The dog stepped back, panting heavily, his eyes fixed on the small hole he had created. Josiah knelt beside the excavation, his joints protesting. In the fading light, he could make out the dull gleam of metal. Using his hands, he carefully brushed away more dirt, revealing what appeared to be a thick iron chain. But this was no ordinary chain. Intricate symbols had been carved into each link, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the dying light. The old slave's blood ran cold. He had seen such markings before, long ago, when he was just a boy. His grandmother, brought over from the Gold Coast, had shown him similar symbols carved into pieces of bone and wood. Protective charms, she had called them, though these felt different. These felt angry. As darkness fell over the plantation, Josiah made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Instead of reporting his find to Master Whitmore, he covered the chain back up with dirt and returned to his cabin. But sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see those symbols, and he could swear he heard the faint sound of metal links clinking together in the wind. Brutus lay at the foot of his bed, but the dog's usual peaceful demeanor had vanished. His ears remained perked, his body tense, as if he were listening for something that only he could hear. And in the distance, barely audible above the night sounds of the Georgia countryside, came the soft, mournful sound of the plantation bell tolling, though no human hand had touched its rope. The next morning brought no relief from the oppressive heat, and Josiah found himself drawn back to the shed despite his better judgment. Brutus had spent the night pacing and whimpering, refusing to eat the scraps of cornbread and fatback that constituted their meager breakfast. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the plantation grounds, other slaves began to notice the dog's strange behavior. Sarah, a young woman who worked in the kitchen of the big house, paused on her way to the well. "That dog of yours been acting mighty peculiar, Josiah," she said, her voice carrying a note of concern. "Been hearing him howling all night. Kept the children awake." Josiah nodded grimly. "Something's got him spooked. Can't figure what." But he could figure it, and that was what terrified him. The chain called to him, even buried beneath the earth. He could feel its presence like a weight on his chest, pressing down with each breath he took. Throughout the morning, as he worked in the cotton fields under the watchful eye of the overseer, Josiah noticed other disturbances. The horses in the stable were restless, stamping and snorting for no apparent reason. The chickens had stopped laying eggs, huddling together in the corners of their coop. Even the plantation's prized hunting dogs seemed on edge, their usual boisterous energy replaced by nervous panting and constant vigilance. It was young Timothy, Master Whitmore's 12-year-old son, who first mentioned the bell. "Papa," the boy said during the midday meal, his voice carrying across the veranda where the family dined, "why does the bell keep ringing at night? It woke me up again." Master Whitmore, a portly man with thinning hair and a perpetually red face, looked up from his plate of ham and grits. "What bell, boy? Ain't nobody ringing no bell. The one by the slave quarters," Timothy insisted. "It's been ringing every night this week. Just once, real slow-like. Mrs. Whitmore, a pale woman who rarely ventured outside the big house, set down her fork with a nervous clatter. "Perhaps one of the slaves is playing pranks, dear. You should speak to the overseer." But Josiah, working within earshot as he tended the garden, knew better. The bell rope hung 20 feet off the ground, and no slave would dare touch it without permission. More troubling still, he had heard it too. A single, mournful toll that seemed to echo not just through the air, but through his very bones. As the afternoon wore on, the heat became almost unbearable. The air shimmered with waves of humidity, and even the insects seemed to move more slowly. It was then that Josiah noticed the first truly disturbing sign. The well water had turned red. Not the rusty red of iron deposits, but a deep, dark red that reminded him uncomfortably of blood. Sarah discovered it first when she went to draw water for the evening meal preparation. Her scream brought several other slaves running, and soon a small crowd had gathered around the stone well. "Lord, have mercy," whispered old Ben, a slave even older than Josiah, who had served as the plantation's blacksmith for decades. "That ain't natural." The overseer, a cruel man named Garrett, with a face like a hatchet and eyes like chips of flint, pushed through the crowd. When he saw the water, his expression darkened. "Which one of you did this?" he demanded, his hand moving instinctively to the whip at his belt. "This is sabotage, pure and simple. Someone's going to pay for this." But even as he spoke, Garrett's voice lacked its usual conviction. The water continued to bubble up from the depths of the well, red as fresh blood, and carrying with it a smell that made everyone step back. The smell of iron and earth and something else, something that spoke of old pain and older anger. That evening, as the slaves gathered in their quarters for their meager supper, the whispers began in earnest. Some spoke of conjure work, of spells cast by enemies of the plantation. Others mentioned the old stories, tales passed down from grandparents who had known Africa, of spirits that could not rest until justice was done. Josiah said nothing, but his eyes kept drifting toward the abandoned shed where the chain lay buried. As darkness fell, and the first stars appeared in the Georgia sky, he made another decision that would prove fateful. He would dig up the chain completely, examine it properly, and try to understand what force had been awakened on Whitmore Plantation. But as he prepared to leave his cabin, Brutus suddenly began to howl, a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry across the entire plantation. And in the distance, clear as a church bell on Sunday morning, came the answering toll of the plantation bell, ringing once in the darkness. The chain was calling, and something was answering back. The third night brought with it a storm that seemed to come from nowhere. Dark clouds rolled across the Georgia sky like smoke from a massive fire, and the wind began to howl through the Spanish moss with an almost human voice. Josiah lay in his cabin, listening to the thunder rumble overhead and feeling the chain's presence grow stronger with each passing hour. Brutus had not stopped pacing since sunset. The massive dog moved back and forth across the small cabin like a caged animal, his eyes fixed on the door as if he could see through it to the buried chain beyond. Every few minutes he would whine softly and look at Josiah with an expression that seemed almost pleading. "I know, boy. Josiah whispered into the darkness. "I feel it too." The storm intensified as midnight approached. Rain lashed against the cabin's thin walls, and the wind grew so strong that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. But it was not the storm that finally drove Josiah from his bed. It was the voices. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks, the way it sometimes did when it blew through the trees and buildings. But as he listened more carefully, he began to make out distinct words, carried on the howling air like messages from the grave. "Free us," the voices whispered. "Free us all." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the storm with a desperation that made Josiah's heart race. He had heard stories of such things from his grandmother, tales of spirits who could not rest until their earthly bonds were broken. But he had never experienced it himself, never felt the weight of the supernatural pressing down on him like a physical force. Unable to bear it any longer, Josiah rose from his bed and pulled on his worn clothes. Brutus immediately moved to the door, his tail wagging for the first time in days. Together, they stepped out into the storm. The rain hit them like a wall of water, soaking them to the skin within seconds. Lightning illuminated the plantation grounds in stark white flashes, revealing a landscape that seemed somehow different, more ominous than it had ever appeared before. The abandoned shed loomed ahead of them like a monument to forgotten sorrows. Fighting against the wind, Josiah made his way to the spot where Brutus had first begun digging. The rain had already begun to wash away the dirt he had used to cover the chain, and he could see the metal gleaming in the lightning flashes. With hands that shook from more than just the cold, he began to dig. The earth seemed to give way easily, as if it wanted to release what it had held for so long. Link by link, the chain emerged from its earthen grave. It was longer than Josiah had imagined, much longer. As he pulled it free, he could see that it stretched back into the darkness beneath the shed, disappearing into what appeared to be a tunnel or underground chamber. The symbols carved into each link became clearer as he cleaned away the dirt. They were not random markings, but a deliberate pattern that seemed to tell a story. Some he recognized from his grandmother's teachings, symbols of protection, of binding, of justice delayed but not denied. Others were unfamiliar, carved with a skill that spoke of desperate urgency and terrible purpose. As the last of the chain came free from the earth, the storm suddenly intensified. The wind began to howl with voices, not just one or two, but dozens, maybe hundreds. They spoke in languages Josiah recognized, and others he did not, but their message was universal. They had been waiting, and now they were free. The plantation bell began to toll, not just once, but continuously, its bronze voice cutting through the storm like a knife. In the big house, lights began to appear in windows as the Whitmore family was awakened by the supernatural cacophony. But it was too late to stop what had been set in motion. Brutus suddenly began to bark, not at the storm or the voices, but at something emerging from the hole where the chain had been buried. A figure was climbing out of the earth, tall, gaunt, and wearing the tattered remains of clothes that had rotted away decades ago. Its eyes glowed with an inner fire, and the chains that had once bound its wrists and ankles now hung loose, broken by death, but not forgotten. The spirit looked directly at Josiah, and when it spoke, its voice carried the weight of years of suffering and the promise of long-awaited vengeance. "The chains are broken," it said, its words somehow audible above the storm. "Now let justice be done." More figures began to emerge from the earth. Men, women, even children, all bearing the marks of bondage, all carrying the same terrible purpose. They had been slaves in life, buried in unmarked graves when their usefulness ended, their chains thrown into the pit with them as a final insult. But death had not ended their bondage. It had only transformed it into something far more dangerous. As Josiah watched in terror and fascination, the spirits began to move toward the big house, their broken chains dragging behind them like the rattling of old bones. The storm followed them, growing stronger with each step they took, as if nature itself was responding to their call for justice. The reckoning had begun, and there would be no stopping it until every debt was paid. The storm that had begun as a natural phenomenon quickly transformed into something far more sinister as the spirits of the long-dead slaves moved across the plantation grounds. Master Whitmore was the first to see them from his bedroom window, pale figures moving through the rain with purpose and terrible grace, their broken chains glinting in the lightning flashes. "Mary!" he shouted to his wife, his voice cracking with fear. "Get the children! Get them now!" Mrs. Whitmore, still in her nightgown, rushed to gather Timothy and their 8-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. The children were already awake, huddled together in Timothy's room as the supernatural storm raged outside their windows. "Papa, what's happening?" Elizabeth cried, her small voice barely audible above the howling wind and the continuous tolling of the plantation bell. But Master Whitmore had no answer. He had spent his entire life believing that the slaves were property, no different from the horses in his stable or the cotton in his fields. The possibility that they might possess souls capable of vengeance had never occurred to him until now. In the slave quarters, panic was spreading as quickly as the supernatural storm. Some of the slaves had barricaded themselves in their cabins, while others had fled into the fields, hoping to escape whatever force had been unleashed. But Josiah remained by the abandoned shed, transfixed by the sight of the spirits emerging from their earthen prison. The first spirit, the tall, gaunt figure who had spoken to him, approached with measured steps. Up close, Josiah could see the terrible marks of his bondage, scars around his wrists and ankles where the chains had cut into his flesh, whip marks across his back that had never healed, and eyes that burned with the accumulated rage of decades. "You freed us," the spirit said, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "But freedom is not enough. Justice must be served." Who are you?" Josiah whispered, though part of him already knew the answer. "I am Ezekiel," the spirit replied. "I was the first to die in this cursed place, buried with my chains as a warning to others. But death could not hold what life could not break." More spirits gathered around them, men and women of all ages, united in death by their shared suffering. Some bore the marks of violence, others showed the slow deterioration of lives worn away by endless labor and hopelessness. All carried their chains, now transformed from symbols of bondage into instruments of retribution. "The master must pay," another spirit spoke, a woman whose gentle face was marred by the rope burns around her neck. "They all must pay for what they have done." Josiah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. "What do you mean to do?" Ezekiel's burning eyes turned toward the big house, where lights blazed in every window as the Whitmore family prepared for whatever was coming. "We mean to collect what is owed, every lash, every chain, every life cut short. All debts will be settled this night." The spirits began to move toward the house, and the storm moved with them. The wind howled with increasing fury, tearing shingles from roofs and uprooting trees that had stood for generations. The rain fell so hard it seemed like a waterfall, and the lightning struck with supernatural frequency, illuminating the advancing army of the dead. Inside the big house, Master Whitmore had armed himself with his hunting rifle and positioned his family in the parlor, the room he considered most defensible. But as the spirits approached, the very walls began to shake, and the windows rattled in their frames, as if the house itself was afraid. "James," Mrs. Whitmore whispered, clutching her children close, "what have we done? What have we done to deserve this?" But Master Whitmore knew exactly what they had done. 3 generations of Whitmores had built their wealth on the backs of enslaved human beings, treating them as less than animals, working them to death and replacing them with fresh bodies from the slave markets. The prosperity of the plantation had been built on a foundation of human suffering, and now that foundation was cracking. The first spirit to reach the house was a young man who had died just the previous winter, worked to death in the cotton fields when he was barely 20 years old. He passed through the front door as if it were made of mist, his chains dragging behind him with a sound like breaking bones. "Master Whitmore," he called, his voice echoing through the house with supernatural power. "Come out and face what you have wrought." The temperature in the house began to drop rapidly, and frost formed on the windows despite the summer heat outside. The children began to cry, and Mrs. Whitmore's breath came out in visible puffs as the supernatural cold settled over them like a shroud. More spirits entered the house, passing through walls and doors with ease. They filled the rooms with their presence, bringing with them the smell of earth and decay and the sound of chains that would never again bind the living. The plantation bell continued to toll, its bronze voice now joined by other sounds, the crack of whips, the cries of the tormented, and the rattle of chains that had been broken but not forgotten. Master Whitmore raised his rifle with shaking hands, but the weapon felt useless against enemies who had already died once. As Ezekiel materialized in the parlor doorway, his burning eyes fixed on the man who had inherited the sins of his fathers, the master of Whitmore Plantation finally understood that some debts could never be escaped. They could only be paid in full. The confrontation in the parlor of the big house was unlike anything the living world had ever witnessed. Master Whitmore stood with his rifle raised, but his hands shook so violently that he could barely hold the weapon steady. Before him, Ezekiel and the other spirits filled the room with their terrible presence, their broken chains creating a symphony of supernatural menace. "You cannot kill what is already dead," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of suffering. "But we can show you what death truly means." The rifle discharged as Master Whitmore's trembling finger found the trigger, but the shot passed harmlessly through Ezekiel's form, embedding itself in the wall behind him. The spirit smiled, an expression more terrifying than any scream, and raised his hand. The chains that had once bound him began to move of their own accord, writhing through the air like serpents made of iron. Mrs. Whitmore screamed as the supernatural cold intensified, and ice began to form on the furniture and walls. The children huddled against their mother, their breath coming in panicked gasps that created clouds of vapor in the freezing air. "Please," Master Whitmore begged, his voice breaking. "My children, they've done nothing wrong." "Neither had ours," replied the spirit of the woman with rope burns around her neck. "Yet they died in chains, worked to death before they could see their 10th birthday. Where was your mercy then?" Outside, the storm had reached apocalyptic proportions. Trees that had stood for centuries were being uprooted and hurled through the air like twigs. The slave quarters were being torn apart by winds that seemed to have a malevolent intelligence, seeking out every hiding place and exposing those who cowered within. But it was not just the Whitmore family who faced judgment that night. Throughout the plantation, other figures of authority found themselves confronted by the spirits of those they had wronged. The overseer, Garrett, was cornered in the stable by the ghost of a young man he had beaten to death the previous spring. The man's spirit bore the marks of the whip, and his eyes burned with the same terrible fire as Ezekiel's. "You remember me, don't you?" the spirit asked, advancing on the cowering overseer. "You said I was lazy, that I needed to be taught a lesson. You taught me, all right. You taught me what hate truly means." Garrett tried to run, but the stable doors slammed shut of their own accord, trapping him inside with the vengeful spirit. His screams echoed across the plantation, mixing with the howling wind and the continuous tolling of the bell. Back in the big house, the confrontation was reaching its climax. More spirits had entered the parlor, filling it with their presence until the very air seemed thick with supernatural energy. They surrounded the Whitmore family, their chains creating a cage of iron and anguish. "What do you want?" Master Whitmore gasped, his rifle now forgotten on the floor. "Justice," Ezekiel replied simply. For every life cut short, every dream destroyed, every chain that bound us to this cursed earth, we want what was stolen from us, our freedom, our dignity, our very humanity. The spirits began to move closer, and as they did, the chains around them began to glow with an otherworldly light. The metal grew hot, then white-hot, until it seemed to burn with the fire of righteous anger itself. "But we are not without mercy," Ezekiel continued, his burning eyes fixed on the terrified children. "The young ones may yet be saved if they learn from the sins of their fathers. But you, James Whitmore, and all who profited from our suffering, you must pay the price." The chains suddenly lashed out, wrapping around Master Whitmore's wrists and ankles with supernatural speed. He cried out in pain as the hot metal seared his flesh, but the spirits showed no mercy. They had worn such chains in life, had felt the bite of iron against their skin every day, until death finally freed them. "Now you know how it feels," the woman spirit said, her voice filled with grim satisfaction. "Now you understand what we endured." Mrs. Whitmore and the children watched in horror as the spirits began to drag Master Whitmore toward the door. But it was young Timothy who found his voice first, stepping forward despite his terror. "Stop!" he cried, his 12-year-old voice cracking with emotion. "I'm sorry. We're all sorry for what happened to you." The spirits paused, and Ezekiel turned his burning gaze on the boy. For a moment, the supernatural cold in the room seemed to lessen, and the howling wind outside grew quieter. "Sorry is not enough," Ezekiel said, but his voice had lost some of its terrible edge. "But it is a beginning." The spirit looked at the children for a long moment, seeing in their faces not the cruelty of their father, but the possibility of redemption. Perhaps the sins of the fathers did not have to be visited upon the children, if those children were willing to learn, to change, to be better than those who came before them. "The plantation will burn," Ezekiel declared, his decision made. "This place of suffering will be cleansed by fire. But you," he pointed at Mrs. Whitmore and the children, "you may leave, take nothing but your lives and never return. Build something better elsewhere, something not founded on the suffering of others." The chains around Master Whitmore tightened, and he screamed as the spirits began to drag him away. But his fate was sealed. He had lived by the chain, and now he would die by it, joining the ranks of the dead who would forever guard against the return of such cruelty. As the spirits departed with their prize, the storm began to change. The wind still howled, but now it carried with it the smell of smoke and the crackle of flames. The reckoning was not yet complete. The plantation itself must burn, erasing forever the physical symbols of bondage and oppression. The age of Whitmore Plantation was ending, and from its ashes, perhaps something better could grow. The fire began in the slave quarters, but not as an act of destruction, as an act of purification. The spirits moved through the ramshackle buildings like avenging angels, their presence igniting flames that burned with supernatural intensity. These were not ordinary fires that consumed wood and cloth, but cleansing flames that seemed to burn away the very essence of suffering that had soaked into every board and nail. Josiah watched from a safe distance as the quarters where he had spent his entire life were consumed by the otherworldly blaze. But strangely, he felt no sadness, only a sense of liberation, as if chains he hadn't even known he was wearing were finally falling away. Brutus stood beside him, no longer agitated, but calm for the first time in days. The dog seemed to understand that this destruction was necessary, that some things were too tainted by evil to be allowed to continue existing. The fire spread with unnatural speed, leaping from building to building, as if guided by an intelligent force. The overseer's house was next, the flames consuming it so quickly that it seemed to simply vanish in a burst of light and heat. Garrett's screams had long since stopped, and Josiah suspected that the cruel man had already paid the ultimate price for his cruelty. In the big house, Mrs. Whitmore gathered her children and what few possessions she could carry. True to Ezekiel's word, the spirits did not harm them, but their presence was everywhere. in the dropping temperature, in the shadows that moved independently of any light source, in the whispers that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Mama, where's Papa?" Elizabeth asked, her small voice trembling with fear and confusion. Mrs. Whitmore had no answer. She had seen her husband dragged away by the spirits, had heard his screams echoing through the supernatural storm, but she could not bring herself to tell her children what she suspected had happened to him. Instead, she simply held them close and prayed that they would all survive the night. The fire reached the main house just as they emerged from the front door. Mrs. Whitmore looked back once at the home where 3 generations of her family had lived, where she had raised her children and planned for their future. But that future was gone now, consumed by the flames of justice that burned away not just wood and stone, but the very foundations of their way of life. "Don't look back," she whispered to her children as they hurried toward the road. "We must never look back." Behind them, the plantation burned with a light that could be seen for miles. The fire climbed into the sky like a beacon, announcing to the world that the age of bondage was ending, at least in this small corner of Georgia. The flames danced and writhed with almost joyful energy, as if they were celebrating their role in this cosmic act of justice. Josiah found himself walking alongside the Whitmore family as they made their way down the long drive that led away from the plantation. It was a strange sight. The former slave and the former masters, united now in their shared exile from the only home they had ever known. "Where will you go?" Josiah asked Mrs. Whitmore, his voice gentle despite everything that had happened. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. We have relatives in Savannah, but how can I explain this? How can I tell them what happened here?" "Tell them the truth," Josiah replied. "Tell them that the dead don't forget, and that justice, even when delayed, will always find a way." As they walked, other figures emerged from the darkness. Slaves who had fled into the fields when the supernatural storm began, now drawn back by the light of the burning plantation. They walked in silence, their faces illuminated by the flames that consumed their former prison. Some carried bundles of their few possessions, while others had nothing but the clothes on their backs. But all of them shared the same expression, a mixture of fear, wonder, and something that might have been hope. They were free now, truly free, not by the grace of their masters, but by the intervention of forces beyond the mortal world. The fire burned through the night, consuming everything that had been built on the foundation of human suffering. The cotton fields, the processing buildings, the stables, the big house, all of it was reduced to ash and memory. Even the plantation bell, which had tolled continuously throughout the supernatural storm, finally fell silent as its tower collapsed in a shower of sparks. As dawn approached, the flames began to die down, leaving behind only smoldering ruins and the acrid smell of smoke. The spirits of the dead slaves had vanished with the darkness, their work complete. The chains that had bound them to the earth were finally broken, not just by death, but by the justice they had claimed for themselves. Josiah stood at the edge of the road, looking back at the devastation. Somewhere in those ruins lay the remains of Master Whitmore, though he suspected that no recognizable trace would ever be found. The man had been claimed by the same forces that had claimed so many of his victims, and his fate served as a warning to any who might think to rebuild such a place of suffering. But it was not just the physical structures that had been destroyed. The very idea of the plantation, the notion that human beings could be owned and worked to death for profit, had been burned away as well. The fire had been more than just flames. It had been a cleansing force that purged the land of its accumulated evil. As the sun rose over the Georgia countryside, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Josiah made a decision. He would not seek out another plantation, would not submit himself to new chains. He was an old man, but he was free now, in a way he had never been before. He would use whatever time remained to him to help others find their own freedom, to ensure that the sacrifice of the spirits had not been in vain. The age of the plantation was ending, and a new age was beginning. An age where the chains of bondage would be replaced by the bonds of human dignity and respect. It would not be easy, and it would not happen quickly, but it would happen. The spirits had shown them the way, and now it was up to the living to follow that path to its conclusion. 5 years had passed since the night Whitmore Plantation burned to the ground, and the story had become legend throughout Georgia and beyond. Some dismissed it as the ravings of traumatized survivors, while others whispered that it was a warning of things to come. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the supernatural justice that had been dispensed that terrible night, the truth was undeniable. Josiah had lived to see his 75th birthday, spending his final years as a free man in the growing city of Savannah. He'd become something of a storyteller, sharing his account of that night with anyone who would listen. Some believed him, others thought him mad, but all were affected by the passion and conviction with which he told his tale. Brutus had passed away peacefully 2 years after the burning, but not before siring a litter of puppies that seemed to inherit their father's supernatural sensitivity. The descendants of that faithful hound could be found throughout the region, and it was said that they could sense the presence of restless spirits and would howl warnings when injustice was about to be committed. Mrs. Whitmore had indeed taken her children to Savannah, where she had struggled to rebuild their lives without the wealth that had been built on human suffering. Timothy, now 17, had become an outspoken advocate for the abolition of slavery, much to the dismay of his mother's relatives. He spoke often of the night the plantation burned, and of the lesson the spirits had taught him about the true cost of human bondage. "I saw them," he would tell anyone who would listen. "I saw the souls of the enslaved, and I understood that they were not property. They were people with hopes and dreams, and the same desire for freedom that burns in every human heart." Elizabeth, now 13, had become a teacher, dedicating her life to educating the children of former slaves. She carried with her always a small piece of chain that had been found in the ruins of the plantation, not as a reminder of the past, but as a promise for the future. The land where Whitmore Plantation had stood remained empty and untouched. Several attempts had been made to purchase and develop it, but each effort had failed under mysterious circumstances. Workers would report strange sounds in the night, the rattle of chains, the tolling of a bell that no longer existed, and voices calling for justice in languages both familiar and foreign. Local folklore claimed that the spirits still walked the land, not as vengeful ghosts, but as guardians, ensuring that no new plantation would ever rise from the ashes of the old. The soil itself seemed to reject any attempt to plant crops, and the few structures that were erected would collapse within days, as if the very earth was rebelling against any return to the old ways. But perhaps the most significant legacy of that night was the change it had sparked in the hearts and minds of those who heard the story. Across the South, other plantations began to experience their own supernatural disturbances. Bells that rang without human hands, chains that rattled in empty rooms, and voices that whispered of justice delayed but not denied. Some plantation owners, terrified by these manifestations, began to treat their slaves with greater humanity. Others, more stubborn in their cruelty, found themselves facing increasingly violent, supernatural retribution. The spirits of Whitmore Plantation had shown the way, and the restless dead throughout the region were following their example. The Underground Railroad, that secret network of safe houses and brave souls who helped enslaved people escape to freedom, found their work aided by mysterious forces. Runaway slaves would report being guided by ghostly figures who knew every hidden path and safe haven, spirits who had once walked those same routes in their desperate flight from bondage. As Josiah lay on his deathbed in a small room above a Savannah boarding house, he was visited one last time by Ezekiel. The spirit appeared not as the terrible, vengeful figure he had been that night at the plantation, but as a man at peace, his chains finally and forever broken. "Thank you," Ezekiel said, his voice now gentle and filled with gratitude. "You helped us find our freedom, and in doing so, you helped others find theirs." Josiah smiled weakly, his old eyes bright with understanding. "It was Brutus who found the chain. I just had the courage to dig it up. Courage is all any of us can offer," Ezekiel replied, "but sometimes that is enough to change the world." As Josiah drew his final breath, he felt a great weight lifting from his shoulders, not just the weight of his years, but the weight of all the injustices he had witnessed and endured. He had lived to see the beginning of the end of slavery, had played his part in the great awakening that would eventually lead to freedom for all. The story of Whitmore Plantation became part of the larger narrative of the American struggle for human rights and dignity. It was told and retold, each generation adding their own understanding to its meaning. Some saw it as a ghost story, others as a parable about justice and redemption. But for those who truly understood its message, it was something more. It was a promise that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched or powerful, could stand forever against the combined will of the human spirit. The chains had been broken, not just by death, but by the courage of those who refused to accept that some people were born to be enslaved, while others were born to be free. The spirits of Whitmore Plantation had shown that justice, even when delayed by decades or centuries, would always find a way to manifest itself in the world. And in the years that followed, as the nation moved inexorably toward the great conflict that would finally end the institution of slavery, the story of that night in Georgia served as both warning and inspiration, a reminder that the dead do not forget, and that the price of injustice, when it finally comes due, must always be paid in full. The plantation was gone, but its legacy lived on, not as a monument to human cruelty, but as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to accept that freedom is anything less than the birthright of every human soul.